Well, hello. I'm delighted to join you for your parish day, and all the more so because of your theme and title, "The Imagination of God." It's been a key theme in my own life, bringing together not only those two words, imagination and God, but what lies behind them. If you think of the imagination and the whole cluster of intuitions, insights, creative shaping spirit that the imagination evokes for us, and on the other hand, the mystery of God Himself, that profound mystery about which we can speak, towards which we can gesture, to whom we can come because He's bodied Himself forth in Christ, but whose mystery we never exhaust, whom we can never define, whom reason can only approach in one way and imagination intuit in another. We need to bring everything we are and can be to the mystery who is God, who Himself then unfolds the mystery of who we are. And perhaps we're living in a culture which has downplayed the imagination in favour of reason, and now we need to reintegrate them. So I want to talk to you as a priest poet about my understanding of how the poetic imagination itself, not the poetic imagination when it's writing a religious poem, but the poetic imagination itself might open out some insights for us into the God in whom we live and move and have our being. So if we're going to think about this, let's begin by thinking about the nature of the poetic imagination itself. What is it? How does it work? And if we're going to make inquiries about this, we may as well ask the poets, and happily we can go straight to the top and consult Shakespeare on this subject, because Shakespeare actually, quite interestingly, quite early on in the arc of his career as a playwright, in a comparatively early play, Midsummer Night's Dream, a wonderful summer imaginative fantasy, gives us a little insight into the poetic imagination and how it works. And I'm going to quote you from that. It's quite interesting. I'm sure you all remember Midsummer Night's Dream, but this particular passage about poetry and the poetic imagination comes quite late. It comes at the beginning of Act 5. And Shakespeare puts it into the mouth of a hostile witness. You may remember that play, that wonderfully moonlit and imaginative play, opens with Duke Theseus, who's about to get married to Hippolyta, the Amazon queen. And Theseus comes across as a rather bluff, practical, sort of homespun Englishman who, in spite of being a mystical duke in Athens, and a sort of no-nonsense kind of character. But in spite of all his no-nonsenseness, we end up, of course, with these four mismatched lovers stealing away from the day-lit, rational courts of Athens and finding, as it happens, a magically enchanted patch of English woodland just up behind the Parthenon. And they go and have these moonlit adventures in which, through Puck and Oberon and Titania, they, as it were, playfully work out almost every possible combination of who loves whom, until they finally come back properly matched and happy. And that's the main course of the play. But Theseus and Hippolyta have stayed in the daylight rationalism of Athens and only hear about it, as it were, off stage. So Act 5 begins with the two of them coming on, having heard these stories, these magical stories about all the transformations in the moonlit wood, and wondering whether to believe them. And Hippolyta reckons there's good reason to believe them, but Theseus wants to say, oh, that's nonsense, you know. So let's just remind ourselves of that passage, because it's got a great deal to say about truth and imagination. So just to remind you, they come on together, and Hippolyta says, oh, 'tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of. Theseus, wanting to dismiss it all, says, what? More strange than true? I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies, that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold, that's the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So I don't know if you noticed in that although Theseus summons up three categories of people you don't want to believe and whom he wishes to dismiss out of hand, i.e. the lunatic, the lover and the poet, he dismisses the lunatic and the lover pretty quickly. Actually, he's making a bit of a mistake there when he says the lover, all is frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. If you're just getting ready for your wedding night, that is not a thing to say to your bride-to-be. We all think we see beauty, but it's not really there. I think he might be taken up on that one a little later, considering his bride is an Amazon queen. Anyway, that's by the by. Shakespeare suddenly gives him a little bit more and amplifies it. The lunatic, the lover are dismissed in a line, and then comes the poet. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, it seems to me that Shakespeare, as I say, in the mouth of a hostile witness, is giving us, in those 5 or 6 lines about the poet, a fundamental insight into the way poetry itself works. And if we start there, and then from there begin to think about what that might tell us about how we understand God as the poet, the maker. You know, of course, that the word poetry and poet comes from a Greek word poiein, which means to make. So the Scots are much more accurate when they call poets makers or makers. You know, that's what you do, you make and shape something. Of course, Shakespeare is intending us to enjoy the irony here, that Theseus was saying, well, you don't want to believe poets, and there's nothing in this poetry, move swiftly on, nothing to see here. But actually, when he's supposed to be dismissing poetry, he is speaking poetry. He is speaking in beautiful iambic pentameters. And of course, really what he's doing is giving not a negative, as he thinks, but a positive account of poetry. So let's see what Shakespeare says about poetry. It starts with vision, doesn't it? It starts with looking. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. So it's about seeing, and it's also about a comprehension of vision. It's about a comprehensiveness, I should say, rather, of vision. Heaven on the one hand, earth on the other. Now, you could say heaven and earth and heaven, is a way of saying everything that is. Nothing is to be excluded from the poet's eye. All things are a fit subject for that visionary moment, which is the kindling of the poetic imagination. And possibly heaven and earth and heaven is almost echoing, I believe in God, the creator of the heaven and the earth, of all things visible and invisible. Indeed, glancing from heaven to earth, glancing from earth to heaven. There may be some sense there of earth, visible earth, where you can begin to comprehend and see. Heaven, invisible, and yet nevertheless a fit subject for poetry. T.S. Eliot once said that poetry is peripheral vision, that as it were, it's, you see, how as it were, you get a glimpse of something peripherally, it's almost in the offing, and the art of the poet is, of course, if you immediately turn to look at it like that, it's gone. The art of the poet is that stillness whereby the hints of the peripheral vision are sort of wooed in. And I don't know if you noticed in that speech of Theseus, he twice uses the passage about the poet's eye and the bodying forth is framed by 2 places where he uses the same pair of words together, and they're different. They're both words about the way we know. So he says that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Then he goes on to tell us about the poet. And then after he's told us about the poet, he returns to those 2 phrases. If it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. I think there's some relation between the apprehend, comprehend on the one hand, and glances from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven on the other. We know what the difference between apprehend and comprehend is. The prehend part of apprehend and comprehend goes back to a Latin word which means to get hold of or grasp. I remember being told when I was studying zoology as a schoolboy that there were certain monkeys with prehensile tails, that they could actually pick things up with their tails. I remember thinking that would be a very useful thing to have. But when we apprehend something, we reach out towards it and we just get a bit of it. We know it's there. We know we haven't got the whole thing, but we've apprehended a little of it. When we comprehend something, on the other hand, we know it fully. We've got our mind literally comprehensively right around it. It's come into the full purview of our knowledge. And we might see knowing itself as on a kind of spectrum between apprehension and comprehension. And we might want to engage the imagination precisely because if the imagination, as Shakespeare says, apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends, then there are certain things which we will eventually comprehend, towards the comprehension of which we are on a journey, but which must begin with apprehension, that the poet doing the apprehending has to get there first. But on the other hand, if poetry is nothing but apprehension, and there's nothing comprehensible about it at all, it wouldn't do anything for us. So this is what Shakespeare says. Shakespeare, if we think of the apprehensive as like the heavenly glimmer, and the comprehended is like the earth. Now let's go back to what Shakespeare says about poetry. So, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And so it has both. And then here's the key word: as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes. Now, I think there's something astonishing going on in the way, we'll use a great, excuse this piece of literary jargon, it was the piece that we were all taught to use in our A-level and undergraduate essays, and this was the great prize word was juxtaposition. As long as you could use the word juxtaposition in an essay, you were assured at least of a 2-1. So but let's just look for a moment at the juxtaposition in that passage of the words imagination and bodies. And it's not even bodies as a noun, it's bodies as a verb in the present continuous. So what does the poet do? He's got these apprehensions and these comprehensions, he's got heaven and earth. The poet brings them together. Imagination bodies forth. Now, if I were to, we were all in a room together and allowed to breathe the same air, and I were to do that awful sort of icky thing that some retreat leaders do of dividing you into 2 groups, and if I assigned to this group the word imagination and to this group the word bodies, and we all did little word association games and brainstorms, and then I asked you to report back, I'm sure the imagination people would come up with wonderful, in a sense, up in the clouds, airy-fairy, filmy, diaphanous shaping stuff. And I'm sure the bodies group, according to where their mood was, they might come up with lots of blood and bone and guts and sinews and sweats, or they might come up with, very beautiful shapeliness and athletically rippling, six-packs and all of that. But they would all be, there'd be scarcely a word in common. One would be so physical and the other would be so, as it were, disembodied. And we tend to think of the imagination as precisely the unreal or the disembodied. Nothing could be further from the truth. So, what imagination does is precisely find a body. It embodies, it bodies forth. It takes that fleeting, invisible apprehension, that, as it were, heavenly glimpse, and finds for it, and in Shakespeare's unforgettable terms, a local habitation and a name. So imagination bodies forth, and look at these words: body, form, shape. Imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes, and then it finally all comes down and says, gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Now, you can see that great art does that. That great art is, as it were, it's not a solid, as it were, opaque block of what it is, all of the earth, utterly comprehensible. It's always the same every time you go to see it. Neither, on the hand, if it's really great art, is it something so disembodied and flimsy that you can't get your mind around it at all. It's much more like a habitation. You go into a work of art, you walk into a poem, you inhabit a piece of music. And the interesting thing is that on the one hand, it's familiar and local, and you've been there before, you've read that poem, you've listened to that piece of Bach many times. And yet your experience is, as it were, of visiting, as it were, a magical or almost haunted house. Every time you go in, some other little apprehension, some piece of your own peripheral vision, some inkling of heaven that you've had, suddenly has made itself at home in this work of art. And the art has given you a picture, an image, a motif, a set of words, finally to speak out something that you'd apprehended before. And it's very interesting. Shakespeare's very generous about the method of the poet here. He says, the poet's eye doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. Actually, you can see this in, if we just take for a moment work of poets, so let's take a couple of 20th century or 20th contemporary poets. Some poets start all up there in the heavens and the apprehension, and then they, as it were, having got that vision, inexplicable vision, they raid the earth and they find one image after another, none of them quite adequate, but they give you another one and another one to try and keep bodying forth. So T.S. Eliot is a classic example of that, both in the early Eliot and in the later Eliot. I mean, quite early, I think it's in Prufrock, he says, I must borrow every changing shape to find expression, dance like a dancing bear, chatter like an ape, that lovely, I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And later, when he's writing about the Christian mysteries, he gives you sublime poetry, and then he says, oh, well, that was a way of putting it, and, words slide, slip, decay. I'm always trying to find another way of saying it. He's got the apprehension. He's constantly looking for the comprehension and bodying it forth. But he's begun, really, with a glance at heaven. Now, to take another great poet of our own time, Seamus Heaney is somebody whose glance doesn't go from heaven to earth, but from earth to heaven. He's really interested in locality, local habitations, the poetry of names. He takes something very earthy always as his starting point. But if he just left you on the earth, you'd go, well, thank you, I enjoyed that, but you haven't got anywhere. It's not. So take, for example, perhaps one of Heaney's most famous poems, the opening poem of his first collection, Death of a Naturalist, which of course is digging. And he starts off with this problem of how to write, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. But suddenly he's distracted, so he thinks, by the sound of a spade in the gravelly ground and his father digging the potato drills. And he looks down instead of up, and he starts to write about digging. And it's just wonderful. You may remember all the language of the squelch and slap of the peat and the lug of the spade nestled into the knee, and the cool feel of the potatoes in our hands, and going down and down for the good stuff, digging. And then he suddenly says this thing, I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it. And at that point, you suddenly realise this poem, which is about digging, is also about that most ineffable of all things, the creative imagination and poetry. And you go back and you realise that every single thing he said about the different kinds of digging and the cutting through living roots and the opening out and the spreading the turf and the giving something to someone who follows you to pick up, every single thing there is telling you about the creative act. But it's telling you about the creative act, if you like, the heavenly thing, precisely because it's been so faithful about the earthly thing. So in the case of both those poets, they do body forth, starting at different points, the form of things unknown. They do make something which is not a solid block, but an open house into which you can come. So that's very helpful. And you can equally see art failing. Whether it's visual art or poetry or music, you can see things which never get bodied forth, which just have remained an obscure abstraction in the poet's mind, and we just don't get it. And the same, but equally, you can see poems of the kind that they tend to print on greetings cards and so on. Where somebody says something nice and sentimental, and it rhymes and it has a cliched image, but you walk all the way around the poem instantly. You've got it, and you go like, "Is that it?" And the poem has given you everything it has to give, first off. There's nothing in it. But when a poem really succeeds, I mean, to take another example, if you think of, say, Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which starts in this very dull, fuddy, clunky, my heart aches, a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though hemlock I had drunk. And, then suddenly he hears the bird, and the bird lifts you out, you go out through the windows into the garden, and then suddenly, right at the back of the poem, he introduces you to these magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn, and you realise the poem has ushered you out of the known into the unknown, and glimmering through the unknown is some numinous beckoning, and it's all there in the poem, and the poem gives you more and more every time you go back into it. So I had long looked at and enjoyed this passage of Shakespeare's and allowed it to shape my sense of what it is to be a poet. But it was only years later, and after my faith it's been renewed and I'd experienced the vocation to priesthood, and I'd finally come to put these sides of my life together and began to write a book called Faith, Hope and Poetry, that this passage of Shakespeare came back to me with a new force. And I knew it had always reminded me of something. There was something about this heaven, earth, heaven, body, forth, local habitation name that was reminiscent of something, and I couldn't think what it was reminiscent of. And then suddenly it dawned on me one day that the whole thing is a beautiful riff on the opening of John's Gospel. That in John's Gospel you get this, anarche and hologos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was with God in the beginning, and all things were made through him, and without him. And it's wonderful. You say to yourself, I realise this is great theology, and I'm sure if I had a fine Greek mind, I'd see even more how great it was. But I can't actually see it. And it's going on like that. And then suddenly you get to verse 14, and it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. In Latin, as Shakespeare would of course known both the Latin text and the earlier English translations. He wouldn't of course had the AV at that point because that didn't come out 1611, but he had the Bishop's Bible and possibly the Dewey, possibly the Geneva Bible, depending on which way you think Shakespeare leant in the theological spectrum. But he would certainly have heard it in Latin as well. Et verbum caro factum est, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. All that God is, all that heaven is, all that could be apprehended of that divine love is not left in some airy abstraction where we can only apprehend it with fine theological minds, but is bodied forth, made flesh, and given, more than that, a local habitation and a name. The importance of the name of Jesus, Yeshua, Yahweh saves. Yahweh, of course, is the unspeakable name. It's the name you can't say, the Tetragrammaton. But when the name is spoken into flesh, it becomes Christ. And, of course, in John's Gospel, you get this beautiful thing. John, the opening of John, as you know, is a sort of itself a riff on Genesis and does exactly the same in the beginning. And, of course, the other thing it does with Genesis is a beautiful reversal, whereas the first question from God to humanity in Genesis is, where are you? Where am I going to find you? Or where you're hiding? And of course it's the other way around when, and in the Latin, as Shakespeare would have known, Magister ubi habitat. Master, where is your habitation? Where are you staying? And Jesus says, come and see. The glance, come and see. And that come and see becomes... and then, of course, in case we didn't get that, the other thing that's going on, again, out of the book of Genesis in John is, which I think Shakespeare picks up on, heaven to earth, earth to heaven, is when Nathaniel comes at the end of that first chapter in John to meet Jesus and recognises him for who he is after this exchange of glances. And Jesus says, do you say this because I said I saw you sitting under the fig tree? You will see greater things. You will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending. And you can imagine Nathaniel going, oh, I know this one, ascending and descending upon Jacob's ladder, and I'm a true Israelite and Jacob was Israel. You can see that. But of course, Jesus doesn't do that. He says, you will see the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. It's a kind of hidden I am saying, I am Jacob's ladder. I am precisely the connection between heaven and earth. And that's how these things will be linked. Now, I think Shakespeare, in this whole passage, is saying this thing we do as poets, where we glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, where we have apprehensions that we want to woo into comprehensions, and comprehensions that we want to open out into apprehensions. What we do when we take heaven and earth and try to link them by bodying forth something with a local habitation is our little echo, it's our version, the imago Dei, the triune poetess. We're making and shaping and bodying forth because we're made in the image of a God who makes and shapes and has fully and finally bodied forth who he is eternally in Christ. And just as in a really good poem, the finite thing opens out to the infinite every time. So, of course, Christ does. Christ's, the particularity of Christ bodied forth and locally habiting in Israel and in Bethlehem and Nazareth and Galilee doesn't stop him from being the Pantocrator and the cosmic Christ, kindling the light and life in every mind that's ever come into the world. They're both there and they're brought together. So when I saw that, I really began to think, I can depend on, I can expect good things from the creative imagination, the poetic imagination in our human life and culture, even when it's not explicitly talking about the Bible, because the Bible itself and Christian doctrine is telling me that there is a divine pattern in our making and shaping, and not only a divine pattern, but a divine enabling, a divine gifting, that insofar as we do this because we do it in and through the Logos, the mind, who was himself bodied forth. So that seemed to me, I must make sure I'm not going on too long, that seemed to me well worth reflecting on, and I hope you'll find it fruitful to reflect on as well. Now, I just want to say something else, riffing back on A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a quarrel going on in that play, which was just beginning to happen culturally, but became massively more extreme after Shakespeare. I think an unnecessary quarrel between reason and imagination. In that dialogue between Theseus and Hippolyta, Theseus is taking the part of reason. He says, this apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And he's saying, well, let's forget about the imagination, let's just have cool reason. And Hippolyta, in that scene, replies, when he says, you don't want to believe this, she replies, but all the story of the night told over, and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancy's images, and grows to something of great constancy, but howsoever strange and admirable. She's saying to Theseus, just a minute, don't dismiss story and imagination. That's going to grow to something of great constancy. That has a truth to tell you. And I think Shakespeare is very much giving us an account of how both reason and imagination are faculties capable of bearing truth-bearing faculties. And one of our difficulties is that we've exalted reason and abased the imagination, and we have therefore a myopic, we have a kind of one-eyed view of the world, and we see a world which is devoid of value and intrinsic truth or beauty because we've simply reduced and quantified it, and we don't understand quality without the imagination. C.S. Lewis, in a late essay, says reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. You can't, that's an interesting way. In fact, I wondered if we might have time to look at a little poem of C.S. Lewis's, which he wrote, interestingly, kind of before, perhaps on the cusp of his conversion, but before it. And interestingly, it's a poem about the relationship between imagination and reason. And it's set in Athens. So maybe there's a little echo of Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's a fascinating poem. When it was published, it wasn't published in Lewis's lifetime, it was published posthumously. And it was given in Walter Hooper's edition the title Reason. When I came to study this poem in much greater depth, I became convinced that Lewis could not possibly have called this poem Reason, because to call it Reason would be to alter the balance between reason and imagination in the poem, and also remove the open question. So eventually I was able to speak to Walter Hooper, and I asked him, and he said, no, actually, Hooper, had needed to give it a title, and imagination happened to occur in capital letters or in the manuscript, so he decided to use it. There have been subsequent critical editions which have taken my argument into account, so I'm happy to say that in the latest edition it's not given a title. If I had to give it a title, I would call this poem Who? Now, here's the setup. This is Lewis writing in the late 1920s. Ceased to be an atheist. He's become a kind of agnostical deist, but not yet a Christian. And he's experiencing a deep split between his reason, which is being sharply honed by his job as, at that point, he was a philosophy don, not an English don, and his secret guilty love of myth and legend and the Norse stories and that kind of thing. Later in his book Surprised by Joy, he wrote about this time in his life. He said, the two hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. I think that may ring bells with a lot of people. And he, of course, he's thinking imaginary is, dismissive. That's the thesis position. Okay, he wrote that years later after he'd become a Christian. But here's what he wrote while he was experiencing that. He figures, as it were, or imagines the soul, his and yours and mine, as being like ancient Athens, with the superb geometric rationalism of the Greeks expressed by the Parthenon on the one hand, but the strange subterranean Eleusinian mysteries on the other. This is what he writes. Set on the soul's acropolis, the reason stands, a virgin armed, commercing with celestial light. And he who sins against her has defiled his own virginity. No cleansing makes his garment white, so clear is reason. But how dark imagining, warm, dark, obscure and infinite, daughter of night. Dark is her brow, the beauty of her eyes with sleep is loaded, and her pains are long, and her delight. Tempt not Athene, wound not in her fertile pains Demeter, nor rebel against her mother right. Oh, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother, who make in me a concord of the depth and height, who make imagination's dim exploring touch ever report the same as intellectual sight? Then could I truly say and not deceive, then wholly say that I believe. Now, isn't that a fantastic poem? It's just astonishingly good. And all these people who dismiss Lewis as some sort of out-of-touch, misogynist, tweed-clad don, and there he is in the 1920s saying, my basic problem is I can't get my inner goddesses together. I mean, he sees these great powers of the soul as divine and in the feminine. But setting that aside, here's the question. He sees imagination is associated with night, darkness, fertility, womb, touch, reason with clarity, sight, daylight. And just as we have the sense of touch and we have the sense of sight, and we have day and we have night, and we have conscious waking and we have dreaming, these need to be enfolded together, and he sees them as utterly split and separate. And he doesn't want to deny either. He says, I can't deny my reason. If something tells me it's not the case, even if I'd like it to be the case, it's not the case. But equally, even if it is the case, it may not be the whole case. There may be more to know. And there's this great question, who will reconcile in me both maid and mother? Who will make a concord of the depth and height? And you're wanting, it's like you want to say, Jack, he's behind you. He's asking exactly the question. The question he's asking is echoing the language of Paul in Ephesians, that you may know, that you may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and breadth and height and depth, and know the love of God which passes knowledge. Who is it who reconciles height and depth? Who, to be frank, comes into the world through somebody who is both maid and mother? You know, the answer is staring him in the face. But it took him another 2 or 3 years to get there. And of course, when he did get there, the two hemispheres of his mind came together, and he understood he could understand Christ rationally and as fact and history, but also imaginatively as myth, and that these things work together, and it was the coming together of those things in Christ that released Lewis's creative powers in the most astonishing way. So it seems to me somewhere between the Shakespeare and the Lewis and our own sense of who we are and how we who are ourselves an idea of God bodied forth, can do our own bits of embodying and honouring what is embodied in others. So I hope you'll find that helpful.